Boa tarde a todos e todas. Estão me ouvindo bem? Ótimo. Então, boa tarde a todos e todas. Sejam bem-vindos e bem-vindas a mais uma tarde do CISUL, né, nosso segundo dia de atividades. Nesta tarde, nós temos, então, uma mesa com palestrantes estrangeiros que vieram agraciar o nosso evento com os seus conhecimentos. E a mesa desta tarde, então, tem por título Decolonialidade, Autonomia e Transformação da Política e Sociedade Global. Nessa tarde nós vamos receber 3 palestrantes, a professora Beatriz Padilla, o professor Mirosław Sadowski e o professor Vineet Thakur. O professor Vineet nós já recebemos, né, professor Igor, que está aqui conosco nas aulas que o professor Peter Veil nos deu no ano passado, então é uma alegria poder recebê-lo novamente. Gostaria, então, com isso, de saudar, além de saudar todo o público, o professor Igor, que está aqui presente também, saudar os nossos palestrantes, na pessoa, então, da professora Beatriz Padilla, o professor Mirosław Sadowski e o professor Vineet Thakur, que já estão conosco na sala online, e então vão iniciar a transmissão. Já podemos? Tá. E eles já podemos passar para eles? Posso passar? Ótimo. Bom, então vamos dar início às atividades da mesa, iniciando pelo professor Mirosław Sadowski, cujo currículo, então, vou apresentar para o público aqui presente e para o público que está nos assistindo no YouTube. O professor Mirosław Sadowski é professor na Escola de Direito da Universidade de Strathclyde, em Glasgow, na Escócia, pesquisador pós-doutor no projeto Mnemonic Reality, do Centro de Estudos Globais da Universidade Aberta de Lisboa, Portugal, bolsista pós-doutor no SEBRAP, Centro Brasileiro de Análise e Planejamento, em São Paulo, e assistente de pesquisa no projeto Memocracy, no Instituto de Ciências Jurídicas da Academia Polonesa de Ciências, em Varsóvia, na Polônia. Seus principais interesses de pesquisa estão nas intersecções entre direito e memória, sociologia do direito, direito do patrimônio cultural e direito das relações administrativas, especiais de Hong Kong e Macau, embora também esteja explorando direito internacional e ciência política em suas pesquisas. I would like to welcome you, Professor Mirosław Sadowski. It's a great honor for us to have you here on our first event of our graduate program. So the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Muito obrigado pelo este convite. Muito obrigado também para o professor Igor e a professora Tatiana, que me convidaram para este evento. Eu vou falar em inglês, porque não sei se os meus copalestrantes também falam em português, mas só queria dizer mais uma vez que é um grande prazer de estar aqui em Brasil, mesmo à distância, e agradeço muito os 2 professores que me convidaram. So moving on to English, once again, thank you for this wonderful invitation, and I'm really honored to be here, invited as a speaker alongside 2 great panelists. So as it was introduced, the subject of our roundtable is decolonialism, autonomy, and transformation of society and politics in the global world. So I'm going to speak about my research, which touches upon these subjects. And I think the general idea I would like to speak about today is that of decoloniality and collective memory in the modern world. Collective memory is my main research approach that I use in my studies. And basically, I'm always asking in my research how law can influence social perceptions of the past, how law can influence the way that we perceive the past. This is the subject, as I said, of my research, which I apply to many different countries, Brazil actually included. And during this talk today, I will touch upon a couple of these. But first of all, let's maybe introduce collective memory itself. So what is collective memory? Collective memory is a concept that has been introduced by a French sociologist, Maurice Aubach, in the 1920s. And he proposed that our memories are not just individual, because quite often when we remember, it's our remembering comes from the outside, comes from the different social groups that we pertain to. So our family, our church, our classroom, and of course, today we can also speak about the biggest group, that of the nation. So how to explain it perhaps better, and how do I usually explain it to my students? So when we think about our earliest memories, so first day in kindergarten, or perhaps some holiday, when we remember those events, we tend to think about them as if these memories come from our own experience only. However, in reality, when we actually think about why do we remember these events the way that we remember them, we'll probably soon realize, unless someone has a perfect recall, which of course sometimes happens, but most likely we'll realize that these memories come from our parents, our grandparents, various photographs, some other people's that somehow told us the story, showed us photos and videos of what happened during the day. So this is so that's how collective memory on this very basic level is created through the coalescing of the different memories of different peoples who form one group in order to create one narrative. And of course, this has not only a typical social use, we can also speak about different uses in politics, about those in authority. And here we have to think only about such examples as street names, for example, on monuments in our cities, which well, the local government under central government in certain cases decides as to which names they will have in order to further a particular narrative, to paint a particular picture of the past that they want us to remember, and perhaps other pasts that they want us to forget. This is, of course, most noticeable in authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. However, it also, of course, happens in democracies. We often have fights, notably today in the US, about school curricula with regards to, for example, teaching history. And once again, by teaching history, a certain narrative is going to be established. And this way, collective memories about the past are going to be formed. So during this intervention, I would like to speak about a couple of such examples from different places around the world of the political use of memory in this decolonial perspective of today's global society and politics. So when it comes to these intersections, as I said, they are most visible perhaps in cities, because the changes that happen are quite often very dramatic, very quick, and as such, they are also easy to perceive. So, for example, when it comes to the colonization of cities, Ukraine, a country that is currently under in Russian invasion, has engaged in a rather interesting, and some would call it belated, decolonization of its cityscapes from Russian collective memories, from the Russian past. So, as some of you may know, after the Berlin Wall fell, after 1989, we had a spur of changes in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And the countries have been either as a part of the Soviet Union or as satellite countries. They were under heavy set of influence from the Soviet Union. And this, of course, involved in addition to many other issues, it is involved changing the cityscapes. So street names were often changed. Sometimes the names of cities themselves were changed. St. Petersburg can be a good example here. Some monuments were removed. New monuments, almost typically of being grateful to the Red Army, were constructed. New national holidays were celebrated, and so on and so forth. After 1989, we have a spur of changes amongst countries of Central and Eastern Europe, a process which was called decommunization. So basically, going back to what was before Second World War, or in certain cases, creating new monuments and new street names as new heroes took place, those of the former communist ones. However, Ukraine, and alongside Belarus and Russia, where this was to a much higher degree, Ukraine only engaged in a sporadic decommunization, mostly centered around the western parts of Ukraine and not touching as such the eastern parts of Ukraine. Many of Lenin monuments, so this typical symbol of the Russian imperialism, of the Soviet imperialism, remained untouched, and only after the so-called Maidan Revolution in the early 2010s, we have the first Russian invasion and occupation of Crimea and eastern parts of Ukraine. We have a national coherent policy of decommunization, which stretched very far. We had a number of specially crafted laws which touched upon different aspects of decommunization, decommunization of the people, which took the form of lustration or vetting for public office. But also we had a policy of changing street names, in one case a name of the city, and the removal of many monuments. So this process started in 2014 and actually is still ongoing, because however, the most symbolic changes happened quickly after 2014. So the removal of certain Soviet monuments, for example, from Kiev and many other places, and only accelerated, of course, during the war. We had a number of final, one would call, removals of this remnants of Soviet imperialism in Ukraine. And also this affected, in a very holistic way, as I said, affected also other areas of public life. So, for example, the so-called, well, not the so-called, but the Ukrainian Institute of Memory. So this is well, it's not an Orwellian institution as it might sound. Institutes of memory are function in many countries of Central and Eastern Europe and are tasked with most typically dealing with the communist and in certain instances also Nazi occupations of the different countries. So, and they're responsible for creating this memory policy of the country. So, for example, one public holiday, the Victory Day, was changed in Ukraine because World Victory Day, very important during communist times in all countries of the region, to celebrate the victory of Nazi Germany in World War II. And why important? It should be important for all the countries of the Allies. Yes, however, other Allied countries signed peace with Nazi Germany on May 8th, and Soviet Russia waited until after midnight so that they would have their own day to celebrate May 9th. So in Ukraine, this day was realigned with the so-called West, so changed to May 8th, and also the language was impacted in many different ways. There was a special glossary prepared by the Ukrainian Institute of Memory as to how to speak about Ukrainian involvement. Ukraine was, of course, part of the Soviet Union during World War II, and how to speak about a Soviet army and the war with Nazi Germany in public spaces, and how to celebrate those events. So Ukraine presents, starting from this city's perspective, we have an all-encompassing program of changing collective memory to fit the new national narrative that was prepared after 2014. And as I said, the changes are still ongoing. So the second country, which I think might be of interest here, is South Africa, where we had the transition from apartheid into democracy in early 1990s, and of course, this decolonization of the society also impacted the decolonization of cities and various official narratives. So after 1994, there was this new narrative of national reconciliation, which took the legal form of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. However, but this spirit of a national reconciliation also impacted the ways that collective narratives, collective memories, also in the cities were reconstructed. So rather than the removal, which we saw in Central and Eastern Europe, South Africa opted most often for recontextualization of various monuments by adding, for example, cultural objects of local ethnic majority to colonial places of memory, as well as creating new memorials. So this policy was often perceived as not radical enough by former victims of apartheid, and resulted in a growing irritation among many South Africans. So in the past few years, we had it was actually an international movement also impacting, or rather reaching the University of Oxford in the UK. The movement Roads Must Fall, so that the monuments to Cecil Rhodes, this epitomization of British colonialism, were supposed to be removed. So in South Africa, after a certain protests, his monuments were removed. At University of Oxford, his monument has been perceived as an integral part of the building right now, and part of the cultural heritage. So it remains still there. Certain streets got new street names and have been changed. And perhaps most interesting one is the one of the monuments in South Africa. So the 1940s Vertrekker monument, which memorializes the Great Trek of that basically established the European history of the country, and is located in a very monumental way in Pretoria, and visible straight from the country's parliament. So this also has been recontextualized by adding certain elements to it. So I can see that my time is almost up. So I'll maybe speak just to finish about two Lusophone examples. So let's start with Portugal, and this is something that I've recently finished working on with two other colleagues. So if you've ever been in Lisbon, then you probably know Padrão dos Descobrimentos, or the Monument of the Discoveries, which is a monument located in the Belém district near Mosteiro dos Jerônimos and other important places in Portuguese history, located also near the place from which ships would leave to the so-called, back in the day, New World. So this monument was constructed during the period of Estado Novo, not the Brazilian, of course, Estado Novo, but the Portuguese Estado Novo, so the dictatorship of Oliver Salazar, which stretched from 1930s to 1970s. First constructed for the Expo in Lisbon in the 1940s, then rebuilt in 1960s. This monument basically presents this typical narrative about Portuguese discoveries. The monument itself is huge. It's shaped on the one side like a cross. On the other side, we have a series of figures led by Henry the Sailor. So we have priests, we have adventurers. What we don't have are, of course, the indigenous peoples of the nations conquered. We don't have slaves. We don't have any mentions of difficult issues of the colonialism, of the Portuguese colonialism. And in a way that's very impactful, in front of the monument, there is a smaller part depicting Portuguese discoveries, and this was donated by the South African government during the time of apartheid. Of course, none of this is something that is not mentioned to tourists. So together, these monuments, which is one of the top 10 or even 5 tourist attractions in Lisbon, presents this very particular narrative of the Portuguese colonial past. As I said, no mentions to any issues surrounding Portuguese colonialism, no mentions of people affected. We have this grandiose monument with also a wonderful terrace upstairs and a perfect view of Lisbon. So of course, this is in today's world controversial. The monument itself was once or twice already defaced by graffiti, denouncing the evils, the atrocities committed by the Portuguese during the colonial period. And more recently, there was a controversy during the Lisbon papal days of youth that took place in Lisbon a couple of months ago. So Vatican Post proposed a commemorative stamp, which was based on the monument, but instead of Henry the Sailor and the adventurers, we had the Pope Francis and world's youth leading him. The stamp was removed. Now it's one of the top collector's items if you're a philatelist. But again, it shows this pervasiveness of these colonial discourses in Portugal. So to sum up, a lot of changes in certain instances are surrounding this narrative. So we have three. I spoke about 3 cases. So we had Ukraine, complete cutting of the past. We have South Africa, where we have some removals, but also mostly recontextualization. And we have Portugal, where no reckoning with the difficult past is done. The old collective memories, the old narratives are still there. So I don't have time to speak about Brazil, but I'm happy to also take the questions later. And I'm really looking forward to hearing my 2 other panelists and the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your talk, Professor Mirosław. It was very important for us to hear about the examples you brought for us. And since you understand Portuguese and you speak so very well, I'm going to address our audience here, so we can
por favor.
Your contribution to our talk today. Acho que foi bastante importante a contribuição do professor Sadowski em função das questões trazidas, né, sobre a questão da permanência da colonialidade, das medidas que são adotadas para tentar superar, né, o legado da colonialidade. Então, as diversas políticas públicas que ele mencionou, tanto no âmbito da Ucrânia, quanto da África do Sul, quanto as dificuldades, né, em fazê-lo em Portugal, nos trazem bastante subsídios para pensarmos especialmente a nossa situação na América Latina e em especial no Brasil, né, que o Brasil ainda é um país cuja a memória coletiva justamente é ainda permeada por símbolos, por discursos, narrativas que provêm justamente desta colonialidade e permitem a permanência de uma colonialidade interna que faz com que nós não consigamos superar certas chagas e dificuldades, né, para o desenvolvimento do país, especialmente para a autonomia, né, do país enquanto um ator internacional importante. Então, me parece bastante elucidadora a fala do professor Sadowski com relação a esses exemplos que nos trazem bastante inputs, bastantes contribuições realmente para pensarmos como na América Latina e especialmente como no Brasil podemos buscar avançar na questão da memória coletiva e do direito à memória, né? Então, isto nos traz bastante aprendizado com relação a como tratar, né, do legado da colonialidade e tentar superá-lo. Então, muito obrigada mais uma vez, professor Sadowski, pela sua contribuição. Nós temos ainda hoje mais 2 palestrantes que estão aqui conosco, acho que já foi combinado, né, professor, que nós vamos fazer as perguntas ao final, né, fazermos isso, todas as perguntas ao final. Então, podemos passar para o nosso segundo palestrante de hoje, para depois fazermos, então, um diálogo com a fala do professor Sadowski, que é a professora Vineet Thakur, que vou apresentá-lo, então, e depois cumprimentá-lo. Já apareceu na tela. Welcome, Professor Thakur. It's a great honor for us to have you here again. I was so happy to see you again because I was at your talk last year. I was watching from home because I was on maternity leave at that moment, but I was so glad to have the opportunity to hear you and to learn from you. So it's a great honor for me to be here today, receiving you again on our graduate program. Professor Thakur, então, professor do Departamento de História e Estudos Internacionais da Universidade de Leiden, nos Países Baixos, pesquisador associado do Instituto de Estudos Avançados da Universidade de Joanesburgo, na África do Sul, doutor pela Universidade de Jawaharlal Nehru, Índia, e autor de obras como Postscripts on Independence, Foreign Policy Ideas, Identity in Institutions in India and South Africa, e Jan's Moods in the Indian Question. So welcome again, Professor Thakur. We're very glad to hear from you again. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Fiorin. I mean, I must start with an apology. I understand no Portuguese, speak no Portuguese. In fact, in your introductions at the very start, the only thing I could understand was when you mentioned Peter Whale. And as some of the, and you mentioned the talk I did last year. Peter Whale is my most favorite person in the world. So already your introduction, even though I didn't understand anything, was measured in gold for me. So I think the focus of my talk is going to be more on sort of my frustrations with post-colonialism. I'm going to talk more about the post-colonial tradition because I come from India, and I'm going to use post-colonial, decolonial sort of interchangeably. There's been a lot of metaphorical blood that has been split through a battery of words and jargons about the difference. But I think I'm going to use the term post-colonial because, one, it rolls off tongue, sort of easily off my tongue, but that's a tradition that I'm more sort of I know more, and I'm going to talk a bit more about India and my frustrations with it in India. But first of all, I want to start by saying that I think much like probably several of you sitting in the room, these past weeks haven't been easy. I don't think many of those who come from post-colonial or decolonial tradition have ever had any compunctions that Western order was liberal order, or the liberal order was necessarily benign. But to me, I think the nakedness of its complicity in what is an ongoing genocide in Gaza has certainly been completely disorienting, if not entirely shocking. No other war, I think, in recent memory, including in Syria and Iraq, have perhaps been as ruthless and as genocidal in its intent as the current war in Gaza. So I think there is no way for us as scholars, students of post-colonialism or decolonial thought, to talk about it without thinking about what our responsibility as scholars is here. And I speak from a university in Europe, and I've sat in the past few weeks with colleagues, who would talk endlessly about conflict as if it's going on in some other part of the world. These somewhat less civilized Muslims and Jews fighting elsewhere in the Middle East, that region again. And they try and offer a very neutral perspective. And frankly, it's so frustrating, and I don't know how to process that as a scholar and even as a person. And I kind of believe that each generation has its cause. There's the Vietnam generation, there's the anti-apartheid South Africa sort of generation, and I kind of feel very strongly that Israeli settler colonialism has to be ours. There is no way we can just sit and talk about decolonization all day and not do anything about it. So my own relationship with post-colonial and decolonial thought has become somewhat fraught in the past couple of years, and primarily two reasons. One, because I come from a country, India, where a right-wing sort of neo-fascist government has completely appropriated the language of post-colonialism. Our right-wing leaders talk better post-colonialism than even post-colonial scholars themselves. In fact, a couple of years ago, there was this book by Deepak, who is very right-wing, sort of, I would call neo-fascist, I wouldn't call him a thinker, but sort of a polemicist. He wrote this book on India, which was blurred by Walter Mignolo. And Walter Mignolo said a lot of things in praise of the book. And of course, when there was criticism of Mignolo blurbing the book, Mignolo's response was, "Oh, I didn't know, I didn't read the whole book." But I think the issue here is not about Walter Mignolo not reading the book. The issue here is that Deepak was able to employ the post-colonial language with such, effectiveness and ferocity that in a way, even Walter Mignolo was fooled in some sense. And I wouldn't say he was fooled, but I think that's what a lot of post-colonial jargon sometimes tend to do. It becomes so much about language itself than the politics. And the second, I think the success, and I think we are at that stage where we can call there is the success of, in some ways, of post-colonial decolonial thought, has also been in some ways its failure, because not only has it been appropriated by the right wing in several places with this whole rise of indigenous thought in some ways, but it has also been appropriated by liberal thinkers in a way that everyone today is a post-colonial scholar. So, this tendency I see most prominently in the discipline that I come from, international relations. International relations, the new term in vogue is global IR, which is very sort of effectively appropriated, I think, the language of post-colonialism and also killed its radicalism. And I kind of fear that post-colonial and decolonial thought and writings in some ways are going the post-structuralist route, where there's so much of focus on discursive deconstruction that we have forgotten that there's a world that exists outside of our words. And in this context, I kind of have a genuine question to ask. Where are our Edward Said's, who would write wonderful tomes on discursive deconstruction? of Orientalism and colonialism, but would also throw stones at illegal occupation. So what I thought I'd do today is an exercise in self-reminder, reminder to myself, and through that, I think with colleagues and scholars and students sitting in the room, about what is post-colonial, decolonial thought, to take a step back and think about what it is entailed to do post-colonial thinking. And I'm obviously going to speak in large generalizations, but I hopefully am able to get the broader points across. In my understanding, post-colonial analysis is supposed to do three things. One, it is supposed to do what Dipesh Chakrabarty once famously called provincializing Europe. Second, it is supposed to engage in a task of restoration and recovery of decolonial thought. And third, which is kind of the thing that I think we've forgotten, is supposed to lead towards a politics of liberation. And these are sort of interconnected aims of, that's what I have thought about of post-colonial thought. So let me come to each of them. First, what does provincializing Europe entail? Now, post-colonial scholarship is critical of the tendency to treat European knowledge as universal. You know, the idea that, for instance, European history is world history, European values are world universal values that have to be aspired for, and that, you know, European perspectives automatically become global perspectives, which could then be applied to all other regions and space. That is problematized by post-colonial scholars. So post-colonial scholars, in a way, expose how our knowledge systems treat Europe as the norm, and consequently deem non-European perspectives as provincial. And here they make two kind of interventions. First, the intervention or the idea is to cut Europe to its size, which is to say that Euro-American perspectives have to be recognized as such, that they are Euro-American and not universal. But this de-universalizing or provincializing Europe does not mean that knowledge from a certain geographical or cultural milieu is only applicable or restricted to that space. After all, if one is arguing that Europe colonized other spaces, could then one also argue that Europe's knowledge didn't travel with it? Of course it did. So quite on the contrary, I think post-colonial approaches point to one, the epistemic violence, the erasure of indigenous knowledge forms and practices that have accompanied colonialism. Without disregarding the contributions of new European knowledge systems, post-colonial approaches counsel attentiveness to the element of hegemony that comes with Western forms of knowledge because of the very specific ways in which colonialism has shaped our practices of knowledge construction, reception, and consumption. Secondly, at the same time, I think what post-colonial scholars also do is sort of to remind us what Fanon once said, that Europe is literally the construction of the third world, which is to say that, which is to imply that an attentiveness we need to have not only that Europe has shaped the world, but also that how Europe itself has been shaped in return. How, for instance, ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity have been shaped by the colonial encounter itself. So, for instance, Gerald Horne has this wonderful book where he talks about how American Revolution was deeply informed by the anxieties of white settlers about abolition of slavery. So freedom, the idea of freedom in American Revolution was actually a worry against abolition of slavery. Charles Mills's wonderful work on the social contract, where he argues that there's a modern racial contract that forms the basis of social contract and the basis of modern statehood, is another way of thinking about how colonial encounter has shaped the West. And here, I think post-colonial and decolonial scholars point to the imbrication of coloniality with modernity, and that is something I think Latin American scholars have talked about and done wonderful work. Which is to say that colonialism and enlightenment were not two different, autonomous, and simultaneous historical processes, but rather that enlightenment was made very much possible by racial and colonial violence. Colonialism was not the negation of the practices of violence. Colonialism was not an exception to the Enlightenment thought or a corruption to the Enlightenment thought. It was very central to the construction of Enlightenment. Enlightenment would not be possible without it. So that's sort of the first stream, of sort of idea that post-colonial thought talks about provincializing Europe. And second, then, the attendant idea is about restoration and recovery. Now, I remember when I was doing my PhD, I think I was there was a lot of lament always about, Europe has done this, but I was in a way a lot of times very frustrated that, okay, if Europe has done what, and we know what Europe has done, but what are we doing in return? And I think this whole idea of restoration of recovery is important, where postcolonial scholars argue that if the first task of postcolonialism or decolonial thought is to reveal the silences and erasures of the histories and experiences of the formerly colonized, the attendant task is then to unsilence those voices, those histories, and those experiences. This is a task of recovery of voices, experiences, knowledges of the colonized. And this recovery requires careful attention to the various sites, stages, and processes through which the colonized were silenced, sometimes deliberately, but also at times by the very routines of method and source collection. So, for instance, it is difficult to archivally retrace the histories of the colonized, because archives themselves are repositories of statehood and privileged official narratives, or narratives of those in positions of culture and political power. So, a privileging of state archives in reconstructing our narratives silences the voices of the marginalized by default in some ways. So, therefore, the task of recovering marginalized voices necessitates looking into alternative archives, alternative forms of historical recovery, including oral and folk histories, memories, as Mirosław was talking just now, poetry, and so on. And then is the third point about liberation, and that is where I think some of our thinking about postcolonialism is sort of falling behind. And I want to sort of discuss here one of the pieces that IR scholar Sankaran Krishna wrote in 1993, where he critiqued post-structuralism. And in his critique, he celebrated the methodological insight that post-structuralism had provided. But it argued that that post-structuralism now had the tendency to dissolve critique into a method rather than use it as a means of liberation. So he was reminding post-structuralists of the original Horkheimer idea of critical theory, which was supposed to be a normative sort of theory, leading towards emancipation. But as Krishna argued that post-structuralists, in a way, because of the whole idea of critiquing everything, have become suspicious of all forms of subjectivity and agency, and tend to further then disadvantage the marginalized or those who are not placed higher in the global hierarchy. This excessive preoccupation, he argued, with discursive practices of representation and meaning making in post-structuralist critique ends up almost erasing the actual physical violence that accompanied the process of world making for the colonized. Here he then argued that post-structuralism provided a compelling narrative of the social constructed nature of subjectivity, but did little to create a space for political action. And here, I think this is the trap that postcolonial scholarship is also kind of falling into. One has to remind ourselves that the purpose of postcolonial scholarship is explicitly normative. It has an agenda of resistance to oppressive social hierarchies. It exposes the violence, both physical and epistemic. And so let's not just focus on the epistemic, that has led to the making of the world and narrates the world from the perspectives of the colonized and the marginalized. Now, unlike post-structuralists who are critical of all forms of essentialism, post-colonial scholars advocate for strategic essentialism, to use Beatriz Padjilla's term, wherein differences within the marginalized are temporarily downplayed to advocate political action. And intersectional action, which is attentive to the intersection of various marginalized identities of race, gender, class, and caste. And here, I think post-structuralist scholarship faces an enormously sort of difficult challenge. The colonized or the racialized are not sort of temporally or spatially consistent categories. The colonized, in one case, can also be the colonizers or oppressor in another. And here, a true post-colonial approach would counsel eternal vigilance against appropriation of critique to perpetuate the hegemonic structures. Most anti-colonial movements have their own castes, class, gender characteristics, and in many cases, the elites in those movements, who were opposed to colonialism, also imposed singular upper caste, class, male ideas of nation. And here I think and I'm speaking from the point of view from post-colonial scholarship in India, what has tended to happen that the post-colonial critique has become a critique which is a very upper caste critique of colonialism, and it completely erases a lot of critique that comes from Dalit scholars, because it fundamentally sort of de-emphasizes any aspects actually of sort of experientiality of Dalit experience, and sort of to put it sort of to explain that a bit, a lot of post-colonial scholarship, for instance, in India, emphasizes that the opposition to British colonialism came from this Indian tendency to spiritualize. So the idea was that if the British were materialistic, Indians responded to that by saying that we are spiritual, and the response, the non-violent response, was kind of a spiritual response, and therefore you have to understand it that way. But the idea of spirituality is a very Brahmanical upper caste idea in India, which completely negates the experientiality of the Dalit experience, which is about body, which is about the experiences of the body. It privileges mind over the body, and that is what a lot of post-colonial scholarship has ended up replicating and doing. And in a way, then we have to fundamentally ask the question that how do we be post-colonial when most post-colonial states today are very colonial? Think about BRICS, for instance. Mignolo also at some point was sort of going gaga over BRICS. But the BRICS countries are not really the most, consistently human rights consistent countries in the world. They are in some ways very liberal. And the trap that post-colonial thought is falling into is that it's ending up justifying a lot of post-colonial violence by post-colonial states, which tend to be very colonial. And that is something I think we need to constantly question ourselves. And here we need to constantly question, sort of interrogate the ethics of post-coloniality. We have to sort of try and interrogate, how do we be self-critical, one, without making it all about ourselves, but in ways that advocate the voices of the really marginalized. And that is the sort of the thought that I want to end with, that our commitment as post-colonial scholarship or scholars has to be always for the most marginalized in the society. Thank you very much.
Your lecture about decoloniality and post-colonial thought and the frustrations on how we are not able to surpass the legacy of coloniality in an adequate way, so we can create autonomy and that were silenced from coloniality. So thank you very much for your lecture. And the questions of our audience will be brought to you in a while after Professor Padilla gives her lecture. So without further ado, let's go to our last speaker, Professor Beatriz Padilla. She's here. Hello. Hi, Professor Padilla. It's an honor, it's a great joy for us to have you here, especially since you were Professor Mariana Gomes, our colleague advisor. So she's sending you her best wishes as well. Professor Padilla, então, possui doutorado e mestrado em Sociologia pela Universidade de Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, mestrado em Assuntos Públicos pela Universidade do Texas, Austin, nos Estados Unidos, bacharelado em Ciência Política e Administração Pública pela Universidade Nacional de Cuyo, na Argentina, e pesquisadora associada no Instituto Universitário de Lisboa. Foi investigadora principal no Instituto Universitário de Lisboa, professora visitante em saúde no Grinnell College e professora associada na Universidade do Minho. Também atuou como consultora para a Organização Internacional das Migrações em diversas ocasiões e para a presidência portuguesa do Conselho da União Europeia em 2007. Professor Padilla We're very happy to have you here and are eager to hear what you have to enlighten us with your lecture. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope the internet is working well. So thank you so much for this invitation. Boa tarde, prazer estar aqui, partilhar convosco. Pediram-me para falar em inglês, então vou tentar, vou passar para a língua inglesa. Thank you very much to my other colleagues that presented wonderful presentations. So probably I can go faster in some of the things. You can move to the second slide. Sorry that I need to ask someone to show the slides because I was not able to do it. So maybe I should start by saying who I am or where I'm speaking from. And I'm here to share my experience and speaking by my experience as a global migration and feminist scholar. I'm not an international relations scholar, but I think because of the different issues we are discussing, this is relevant. Also, I would like to share my positionality. I'm an academic of the Global South, living in the Global North, who was trained in the Global North, but I think I have always been very, very critical. And I try to speak also from those who are, from the perspective of those who are disempowered. And as you can imagine, being a Latina in the US, I cannot speak from the majority perspective, right, or the mainstream. And I hold critical views on globalization and the knowledge productions and dissemination. Next. So I would like to start with some basic definitions. One is, from sexism, racism, and colonialism. Racism, sexism, and colonialism, they all have different meanings. They have been defined different ways, depending on the eyes of the beholder, but I think they all share something in common, some elements in common. So they all represent system of oppression and power imbalance. In the case of race and ethnicity, and I like to hold that I use race and ethnicity together because mainly in Europe and in the US, most people use race, but I think that we need to understand that they got together. So regarding race and ethnicity, we talk about the domination of people of color, mainly by white and Europeans group. And also, I'll be referring a lot to Europeans. Along Europeans are also North Americans. Regarding sex and gender, is the domination of women by men, mainly and also where women of colors are in subordinate position as well. And referring to colonial domination is the global north or the first world or the Western over the third world or global south. All of these thoughts, all of these perspectives are also context specific. So we need to think about who are the people of colors, also to include the idea of mixing or mestizagem, and where these people are, who are the women, although we agree that the weak, how it's called, the weak sex of the gender, but also where they are located and who are these women, and who are considered part of the global north and global south. We also know that in the global south, there's a global south in the global north and a global north in the global south. Next. Having issues move on my slide. Okay, so regarding some basic definition of racism, racism means prejudice or discrimination based on race and ethnicity, again, accounting for power imbalance between the groups. This translates into the structural systemic oppression of groups that do not have power, be that social, political, economic, and cultural. Then oppression becomes apparent in many ways: inequality of rights and freedoms, being treated as a second-class citizen, segregation, electoral disenfranchisement, as well as outcomes, including the poor outcomes that people have in health, well-being, education, access to resources. In the context of the global north, this means the oppression of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or sometimes how it's been called BIPOC, or people who are perceived as inferior. This is known as a structural systemic racism and ethnicization, and also being or becoming a minority, or whatever now is also being referred as the minoritization, as, for example, the case of Latinos in the US. Next. Colonialism means the control of a territory and or people by the external power, where the colonizer holds the power and the colonized are reduced to being objects of exploitation. In this case, the West and the global North over the Third World or the global South, but not just in the past, also in the present. And that's why we talk about neocolonialism, because neocolonialism maintains a similar oppressive system, but operates under the guise of economic and cultural dominance over a dependent area or territory or people, namely in knowledge production and cultural imperialism. So there are new ways to dominate. So in this case, I would like to think, or let think with you about new forms of international or regional domination and agenda setting. So for example, I'm referring to Ibero-American or the Ibero-American summits, for example, that tend to be controlled from Spain or from Madrid. Or when we talk about the Americas being the Summit of the Americas with, a clear agenda. I'll talk later about the last Summit of the Americas. Or if we want to refer to the Lusophone world, the CPLP, which is the Community of Portuguese-speaking countries, who sets the agenda, who sets the norms, or PALOP, which is the African country's official Portuguese language, which is still, in most cases is dominated from Lisbon. So all of these areas or geographical areas are ways where we see colonialism or neocolonialism being implemented, being spread. And with the domination, from, in this case, mainly Europe. I'm not going to be talking about the US and, and the policy of the backyard policy, but just focus on this for now on. And lastly, I also would like to bring the idea of feminism. Next, please. Okay. The definition of feminism, as I mentioned, I'm a scholar, I'm a feminist, and I think that feminism means it is a very relevant aspect when we talk about colonialism or decolonial and what's going on in the world. Feminism means all genders have equal rights and opportunity, and obviously this has become still like wishful thinking. The idea is respecting diverse women's experiences, identities, knowledge, and strengths, and striving to empower all women to realize their full rights. Ensuring that diverse women and girls have the same opportunities in life available to boys and men. Feminism does not embrace just heteronormativity, but also endorses inclusivity. And feminism goes along with the idea of intersectionality that was mentioned as well, which calls the attention to recognizing how gender and sex and other forms of discrimination interact, for example, considering race and ethnicity, age, class, socioeconomic status, physical or mental ability, sexual identity and orientation, religions, among others. So what we're trying to say is that all experiences are relevant, not just a few. And in this case, I'm thinking of how the experience, including all the experience of feminists from the global South. As so far we know that sisterhood or global sisterhood has not been attained, and it has been, it is still something difficult, because there are women, especially from the global North, trying to impose their agenda, to impose their issues to all of us. So next, thinking about the colonial thoughts and coloniality. The colonial thought and coloniality are concepts and ideas and theories conceived by thinkers from and in the global South. I know that there's a lot of discussion. My colleague already presented some of the issues, which I totally agree. So I'm not just referring to Quijano, but also Mignolo, Duce, Torres, Coronil, Grossfogel. I'm excluding Boaventura de Sousa Santos because of, because of the several issues that and the discussion around him. But personally, I have always seen thing that we from the Global South needs translation to the Global North. So a lot of people are actually taking advantages of what has been thought from the Global South to still dominate and sell the ideas in the Global North. And regarding this, I think there has been an overuse of the idea of the colonial by the Global North. Now everyone is trying to, and I think that my colleagues also was also saying that everyone is trying to decolonize something, or everything needs to be decolonized, which, I do agree that decolonizing is important, but sometimes, or most of the time, the way that decolonizing is taking place is still being decolonial from a perspective of the Global North. So we still, if you need to decolonize your syllabus to teach, then again, you always using people that write in English. So how do you supposed to decolonize in those languages? And a lot of the scholars from the Global North are not even reading what the Global South is saying, it's just appropriating their ideas. So Quijano and others argue that current globalization is the culmination of the process that started with the European colonization or conquest, including the classification of people according to race, and again, I ask ethnicity, exploitation, and given rationality, the idea that was presented, Eurocentrism. But I, again, like to include other actors to the idea of Eurocentrism as people in, for example, the United States or North America. So coloniality translates in the perception of inferiority of people of other races or ethnicities, other genders or sex, located in the Global South in general or in the Global North, but those who are disenfranchised. Again, for example, Latinos in the US. If we think of how independence in Latin American countries translated into decolonization, but it did not translate it into decoloniality, because this mentality of being colonized, as also was mentioned, is still much present, persisted. And I like to add here to some of the authors that I mentioned, I like to add sex and gender and feminism, because a lot of the time, or most of the time, coloniality has been gender blind. So I would like to bring the work of Maria Lugones, of all other feminists from the Global South who are working towards that. So why I think that this roundtable is so appealing? I was, happy to see the invitation, because I think it is closely related to my research agenda, which is global migrations. I work on global migrations, migration and integration policies, gender and inequalities. And most of the time, their research agenda and all other kind of agenda is set by the Global North. And the Global South has to be more passive and accept what is being proposed. So I think this is something that we need to change. Global and colonial migrations also provide the perfect scenario, or what I call the perfect storm and framework to apply the idea of coloniality and to deconstruct the colonial subject in the metropolis. So that's what I do. I see migrants, or when the migrants move from the periphery, right? If follow the theory, to the metropolis, and this has implication, because it's not just any migrant moving to the metropolis; it's the migrants from the countries that were colonized by the colonizers, that has specific connotations. How are these migrants perceived? Their issues of race and ethnicity, gender, skills, or the process of the skillings that all these migrants experience, and the poverty trap. In this case, the idea of proximity based on language and culture proximity, or being close to the colonizer, is used to build relations, but still keeping the distance. So we want them because they speak the same language, then we don't have to waste time for them to learn the language, but they're still different from us. because we're much better, right? And the question, and also helps to question the idea of the receiving country bias. So most of the time, migration studies focusing on the destination and knowing the root causes of what is that cause that migration of them or the mobility. So regarding colonialism and neocolonialism, the dominant perspective when considering bilateral or international relations has been, from Europe or the European Union nowadays in relation to Latin America, or Spain and Portugal with Latin America, or Portugal, Spain with former colonies in Africa. So the agenda is set, from the global north. The same thing, the same dominant perspective when considering the so-called post-colonial migrant. So the Latin American migrants in Spain or in Portugal, or Africans from the Portuguese-speaking countries in Portugal. That relation of domination, that relation of, or that situation of inequalities has been proved all the time. We have seen all these publications, and that's always the perspective. And I don't want to get into the details, but probably you saw a few weeks ago a video around about this Portuguese female insulting a Brazilian woman arriving at the Lisbon airport. So that, I think, is very clear. It kind of summarizes what is going on. And along colonialism and neocolonialism, I think we need to consider the issue of gender. When when sex tourism happened, or when there's like human trafficking in Latin America, it refers back to the idea of the Western men, or the people, the men from global north going to the global south, to Latin America, and exploiting women. And whenever we study migration in the global north, we see the hypersexualization of female migrants from Latin America. And they're always portrayed as, these are the women, they come to break up the families, or they're gold diggers, or they come to steal the husbands. So just to jump into how the international migration policy making and discourse takes place, we know that a lot of the policies and the discourse come from the international organization, like the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. But they all tend to represent the global south. Although all countries are represented, the agenda comes much more imposed from the global north. So we had the last, some of the few of the last serious discussion on migration. One was called the Global Compact on Migration that was discussed recently, and tried to organize migration. For example, tried to talk about the comprehensive approach to human mobility, the enhanced cooperation at the global level. But all this discussion end up in signing something that is non-binding. So it's something that does not make countries to follow a certain principle. And if you see, for example, in the first map, where you can see the countries that actually voted when they had to vote on the Global Compact on migration, you see the ones that voted against is, for example, the United States and some countries in Europe, while all the others voted in favor and some countries abstained. And you see here, like the global north and global south play a role. The same thing in the International Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and the Member of their Family that was signed in 2003. We're still waiting for so many countries to sign this convention. And then in the second map, you see how many countries have not signed that agreement. So they're not actually interested in defending migrant workers or their families. So who leads this organization and who signed these conventions and agreements? So what I'm trying to say, I'm maybe going to skip the migration trends in Latin America, which have been changing a lot. And it's, and what we've seen in the last maybe 10 years or so is that Latin America, that has been portrayed as a country, as a region of emigration, is not actually true. It is also a lot of people migrate from Latin America too, but a lot of the migrants also stay in Latin America. So it's a country that experiences different trends. And we see a lot of changes with Colombia, for example, that Colombia, due to the war and the conflict, had to migrate to Venezuela, but also due to what happened in Venezuela, many had to migrate back, and now there are new migration trends taking place in the region. Haiti, with the 2010 earthquake, was a huge wave of migration, and onward migration in the region, with the destination Brazil and Chile as destination, but now a lot of them, due to discrimination and exclusion, like walking to the US-Mexican border. The migration crisis with Venezuela, with the massive displacement of people, the majority of Venezuelans are contained in Latin America. And all their crises regarding the Central America, and even Mexico changing its role from being an immigration state, or Mexican live in Mexico, but now Mexico becoming a country of immigration, or receiving, or at least a buffer state, because it has to contain the migrants going to the United States. I'm going to skip the next one on the crossing of the Darien Gap. So, and some of the features, maybe you can move, go to the next one. And go to the next one. Okay, next one. So what I wanted to bring is that the idea that in Latin America, we have been discussing migration. So not all the discussion has to come from the global north. And migration has been an issue in the Americas. And the way that this discussion takes place is usually a little bit different from the way it's being discussed in the global north. So as a region, Latin America has experience in dealing with migration issues. And so, for example, with the South American Conference on Migration that started in the year 2000, the aim was providing a platform for consultation for Latin American countries in the primary areas of development, diaspora, rights to migrants, integration, information exchange, migration statistics, climate change, counter-trafficking, and counter-smuggling. So, but also ensuring human rights. So this preoccupation with migration has been present in the region, but with a different focus. And there are several migration networks within this group of countries that are working and trying to discuss or migration from a more autonomous position and capacity to focus on the migration perspective, not just the criminalization. Next. And then you had, for example, can you move to the next one? Next. Okay, and here, for example, even Mercosur was created in 1991, and it was seen only as a trade bloc, and it was signed by Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And other countries like Bolivia and Venezuela have been moving in and out of being part of Mercosur. But I think it's very, very interesting how a trade bloc that was created with just the idea of focusing on trade has moved forward to include migration and the free circulation of people. So and holding a preoccupation with human rights and respect to migrants. So there's a whole mechanism, and I'm not going to go over about the governance of migration, even within Mercosur. So I think that is also something that we can learn. So the global north can learn from us. Next. I'm not going to, again, go over detail for the different places, the different policies that countries in Latin America have put forward Venezuelans in the region. But you see a variety of policies that have tried to help and deal with the situation of the millions and millions of Venezuelans that have been migrating throughout the region. So people that countries that have been applying, digamos, friendly legal frameworks to make life easier for Venezuelans like Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, countries that have created specific measures for Venezuela, countries that have not adopted any measure too, countries that have assigned refugee status using the Cartagena Declaration, such as Mexico, countries that have opted for regularization programs for Venezuelans, and countries that actually are moving in a different direction, like the Dominican Republic and Trinidad, criminalizing Venezuela migration. But you see a whole variety all coming from the region. Also, more to learn, the Summit of the Americas. The Summit of the Americas started led by the United States in 1994 and have been institutionalized. It's an institutional way for different heads of state and government to gather together. And more lately, they have been adding or getting more interested in migration issues. And I'll talk about this in a second. But also the Organization of American States that intervene in the field of migration. The Organization of American States is the oldest bloc in the Americas and even in the world. And there are like so many, as you can see, like so many different aspects of migration that they're dealing with. So there's plenty that has been done from the region. And then you can move to the next one that talks about the Los Angeles Declaration, as it was done last year, thinking, led by President Biden, thinking, okay, now we're going to bring the idea of migration to be central in Latin America. But actually, if you are critical of this, you can think, well, we have been talking about this for a long time. It's not just because the US realized that this is relevant, it's the way that we need to deal with. In this case, Biden invited many Latin American countries, not all of them because of different issues that we're not going to discuss here, but also brought an external guest. And you wonder why in the hell was President Biden going to invite an external guest, in this case, Spain, the colonial state, to the negotiation? Actually was trying to ask for some help to Spain to host and receive migrants, but also show that, they don't know a lot about what's going on in Latin America or even between Latin America and Spain. So all the idea was to discuss migration and again, try to stabilize migration and say, at least in the discourse, they're going to invest in the root causes of migration. But since then, nothing has been done. So again, it's a lot of creating a lot of expectation, but then not doing much to address the issue of migration in the Americas. And my final thoughts about transforming the global politics and societies toward a better model is that the idea that we need to fight the coloniality mindset in Latin America. That's up to us to do it. Oppose colonialism and not neocolonialism, and oppose racism, discrimination, and sexism, and try to favor also international regional spaces of negotiation, action, and intervention, recognizing the relevance, because we should not just go and to these global forums and accept whatever we're told, because we do have experience, and we have the experience in Latin America has shown to be much more productive in the field of migration, but also in the field of trade and development. And we need to generate our own agenda, working together instead of working against each other. So thank you very much.
For your contribution for our discussion here today. I think we agreed on taking questions for Professor Padilla first, right? As perguntas, professora. So I'll address our audience so we can see if we have questions for you, and then questions for our other speakers today. Pessoal, temos perguntas para a professora Beatriz? Alguém interessado em fazer algum questionamento? Não? Então, gostaria de fazer eu mesma uma pergunta, então, para a professora. Vou fazê-la primeiro em português, professora, e depois faço a tradução para o inglês para os professores que estão conosco na sala também entenderem. Muito bem, então, eu gostaria de perguntar, dada os dados e arcabouço, né, de normas, instituições e questões que foram trazidas na sua fala, com relação à perspectiva da solidariedade que a senhora trouxe ao final, que me parece extremamente importante e um caminho justamente para que possamos superar a colonialidade, especialmente a colonialidade interna, que ainda persiste na maior parte dos países na nossa região, e que nos impede justamente de avançar no sentido de superar a dependência colonial que ainda persiste. Nesse sentido, eu gostaria de perguntar, face à proposta da solidariedade e de atuar conjuntamente enquanto região, né, nos fóruns, diversos fóruns internacionais, especialmente nessas questões migratórias, como a senhora percebe hoje as circunstâncias das possibilidades da região da América Latina, especialmente na América do Sul, dada a recente vitória do Javier Milei na Argentina, com uma agenda muito parecida, né, e um discurso muito parecido com aquilo que nós tivemos no governo anterior no Brasil, e se há possibilidade de o governo Lula, no seu terceiro mandato aqui no Brasil, exercer um papel de conciliador da região nessas agendas. Então, eu queria saber a sua opinião sobre isso. Vou só traduzir para os nossos colegas, professor Thakur e professor Sadowski, poderem entender também. Professors, my question to Professor Padilla concerns the solidarity on the Latin American region to work together on international forums, and how she perceives the today's context of governmental changes in our region, especially with the recent election of Javier Milei in Argentina, and if she perceives that our government here in Brazil of President Lula can exercise a role of a conciliator, of a mediator for the region in international forums. So, Professor Padilla, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you. Should I answer in Portuguese or in English? Doesn't matter.
I think in English, so Professor Sadowski and Thakur
okay,
can understand.
Thank you for your question. Actually, I am in Buenos Aires right now. So it is too soon to say anything. I think that Brazil obviously plays a very relevant role in the region. But I feel that it would be too risky at this moment to say that Brazil or Chile or Colombia could play any relevant role. And if you pay attention to the countries I'm referring to, are countries that, at this point in time are perceived as countries who are to the left, who have been named and labeled socialist, communist, and so I am sorry for the results of the elections, and I think that it is, maybe this is going to bring some imbalance or more instability in the region. No one knows exactly what's going to happen. His opinions or his position on migrants are not as open, are not, as you know, he's and like the vice president elect are people who are denying the history of Argentina. The previous colleague talked about collective memory. So people who are neglecting and denying the collective memory of the dictatorship. So it is very difficult to say. It is very difficult to say. I hope, as a migrant, as a migration scholar, that this is not going to mean any change in policymaking, in receiving migrants, or in being very, very pro human rights in relation to migration and human rights, the human right of migrants. But it is very uncertain what's going to happen. I'm not so sure that at this point also like a mediation role is going to solve it, or so it is, you know, a very complicated situation. So that's all I can say. What I'm worried about is the whole region, you know, things that are changing or taking place in the whole region, including the United States. And because I teach, and I did not mention this, but because I teach in Florida, is a state that it has become very, very, very conservative, very, very, very anti-migrant, and also very anti-freedom in teaching. So actually, I tend to teach on ethnic and racial relations, on migrations, and we are not allowed to say, for example, that systemic racism exists. So we are getting into serious trouble in that front, and I think that's, you know, it's going along to what is happening in several places in the world. So I think as decolonial scholars or post-colonial scholars, this is a very important time to take position if you can. A lot of people, a lot of my colleagues are very afraid of what's going on. And for example, sociology as or introduction to sociology has just been banned from being able to be taught as a general curriculum course. So we're talking about serious changes coming from the very global north, I mean, in the United States.
Thank you so much for your response. Do we have other questions for our speakers? Muriel?
Olá, boa tarde. Eu vou fazer pergunta em português, tá? Eu gostaria de saber um pouco mais, assim, sobre essas questões que você mencionou, que pesquisa bastante sobre as questões de integração na sociedade. Eu sei que tu trabalha com o conceito de superdiversidade, e eu queria pensar, assim, o que tu acha das possibilidades de a gente trazer. Eu sei das dificuldades de aplicar a superdiversidade na prática, e é muito complicado, às vezes a gente tem dificuldade de ver a etnografia situada nas RI. Então, quais são as possibilidades de a gente pensar pesquisas empíricas que debatem esse conceito e pensam a integração nas relações internacionais, e também como a gente pode aproximar o conceito de superdiversidade, enfim, das questões interseccionais, que também eu acho que são bastante importantes, assim. Então, quais são as possibilidades de a gente trazer, assim, essas discussões que não estão tão integradas, assim, nas RI, e como fazer isso na prática, que eu acho que é um desafio.
I'll just summarize for our guests in the virtual room. Muriel asks, which are the possibilities for bringing super diversity, intersectionality, and other concepts and new agendas on about research for the international relations field? Professor Padilla, if you can.
Thank you for this question. I think this is a great question. I think that the issue of, or the concept of super diversity can be applied to Latin America. It can be applied to Brazil. But yes, the way you apply it should be done accordingly to your situation. And I think sometimes what happens is most when someone comes up with a concept, like the concept of super diversity or conviviality, they're both coming even from the UK, right? And then everyone is trying to apply it around the world. But I think the richness is when you apply the concept, that you apply it to your own reality. I think that nowadays there's no way to not use intersectionality, because not using the concept of the idea of intersectionality is actually being blind or deaf of so many things that are happening, right? So I think that intersectionality can be applied almost everywhere, but you also adapt it. You adapt it to the society. You are going to see what are the relevant intersections, and you're also going to see what are the relevant diversities that are taking place in Brazil, for example. And we should not just talk about Brazil as a whole, and just giving an example based on Brazil, but there are several Brazils within Brazil. There are different situations among Brazilian women. There are different situations across the country. You have Afro-Brazilian, you have people who are indigenous, you have a lot of people who are a mix. So, or feel that they due to mestizaje, right? So I think it is important that you consider and you adapt the concepts to your own reality, instead of just bringing out and try to apply it. I had done that a lot because although I use it and I accept it, if you read the articles, we're also very critical. And I don't know if this is the right place, but it should be important that when we try to adapt, something that we go through is the process of publication. And sometimes we still need to request for publications, because many times we're forced to say or to change or to use certain authors because someone decided that was a relevant author. So I can say that I have experienced that myself. And sometimes if you're trying to be too critical of a certain concept, they will not publish. So these are things that I think relevant to discuss in a forum like this one. So we can learn a lot from applying certain concepts. We can also do a lot adapting to our own realities, and sometimes resisting as much as possible in the way we want to publish it.
Thank you so much for your response, Professor Padilla. Temos mais alguma pergunta? Cássio here is going to ask you a question.
Hi, my name is Cássio. I'm going to ask about migration, environmental migration or climate migration, and how can we talk about colonialism about this, and if you can talk about how destination countries, sorry, I forgot the word, and to talk about destination for climate migrations and all environmental migrations, and how can we learn from this from now, before the things start to happen.
Professor.
Okay, this is an excellent question. And I think that, again, this is an excellent question for an excellent scenario, because if you think about climate migration, we thought first that climate migration was something, or that climate change was taking place only in certain places. But now we realize that it's taking place in many places, but also that a lot of the investment, a lot of the situations that are taking place in our countries. So, for example, if you just focus on mine, on mine exploitation, right? It is going to have consequences in our country. So, by destroying the environment in the mountains, by destroying the environment in Amazonia, right? That is causing people to migrate. This migration or this mobility can take place within the same country, but also outside of the country. And now everyone is talking about what's happening in the Darien Gap, right? With like so many migrants, like going through the Darien Gap. That was something that, no one would do maybe 10 years ago. And now it's like the path. That's also having an impact on the ecosystem, on, what's happening around that area. All the different things, including business of different kinds that are taking place in the Darien Gap. But you also saw like the countries that are considered or are always taken or defined as the good countries. I'm just going to give an example of like Canada that always go to the forums and defend or are against colonialism, or they say that to give voices to the indigenous people, to women, etc. But then when they move abroad with an investment, especially we know of the different investment like in Argentina, but also in Panama with lithium and other minerals, they go there and they destroy the environment. So you practice different, they're like different discourses, and you practice different things depending whether you're in your own country or whether you are abroad, right? So we are noticing that, a lot of people will have to move away from, where they were born, because there are no resources, there are no jobs, so there are only certain kind of jobs. And we see that much more. And many countries still are in denial of climate change. For example, again, the United States, or many states within the United States. Again, we are not allowed to talk or discuss issues of climate change in Florida. I'm not so sure if I answered your question.
Thank you so much, Professor Padilla. It was very enlightening. And it's a very hard situation to be teaching in Florida right now for you. It's very, very moving. Do we have another question for Professor Padilla or for the other professors?
I want to thank all the three of the professors for this speech. It was a very good lecture. I wanted to ask for the other two professors and also for Professor Padilla. I just wanted to know that it's kind of a basic question, but as Professor Joséli has already asked for Professor Padilla, but what is yours? What do you think that is the consequences for your regions? What is happening here in the South, in South America? More because I guess we normally just think like South American people, and I just wanted to have another perspective of what could happen about this new attempt to Brazil to become this leader in South America, and this new government here. So that's what I wanted to ask. And I guess I just wanted to add also that I don't know what professor was the second one that talked, but some parts didn't got stuck, so I didn't get all the information. So if you want to share a little bit more, I would like to hear it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we can start with Professor Padilla, please.
So I'm not so sure again about like a leadership or a country taking leadership in our region. I'm not so sure how that could work. At this moment, there are like too many changes taking place or that supposed to take place, and we are not so sure. So in addition to Argentina, we don't know what's going to happen with Guatemala, for example. soon there are going to be elections in Mexico. So I think there are like way too many things happening. And what I've been more worried about is that how the so-called the new left in some of the countries have been going wrong or have not been so successful. I mentioned the case of Chile, Colombia, and well, now you have Brazil as well with Lula. And I think there's a lot of opposition from abroad trying to picture our countries as, I wouldn't say making fun, but not picture them as successful, or how bad either the left or socialism, depending, some people even talk about communism, is being bad for Latin America. So that's one of my preoccupation. I think the migration relates to all these issues, because anything that goes bad is always then blamed to migration in certain countries. And so migrants become the scapegoat in many ways. So I'm not so sure if I understood your question of that, what you were referring. I would like to see more unity among Latin American countries, but I'm not so sure, because I think many times we are spending more time in, because of the coloniality mentality, we're spending more time in being like people's pleaser, trying to please others, especially the global north, and to be the good student or the good disciple. Which translate in being good for whatever the global north wants, not for whatever we want in Latin America. So I think that overcoming coloniality is the first step toward being, gaining autonomy as a region and gaining a position. Although I also recognize that from the global north, sometimes there's not a lot of attention being paid to the global south or to Latin America. So they're very complex situation. And I don't think that any of like the relevant discourse or discussion that are taking place in, for example, the United States, are very worried at all about Latin America, unless just the issue of migration, how to stop migration, and how to stop the wall, and maybe build a wall, in the Guatemalan and Mexican border or in Panama. So how you can make it to go south. And that was been happening, how more Latin American countries are kind of working for the US to keep migrants away. The farther away from the US-Mexican border, the better. So that's why the investment, and when there's money, that will happen. That was what happened with Turkey when the refugee crisis took place in Europe. A lot of money from the European Union going to Turkey, so they would stop the refugees coming mainly from Syria. So we're kind of like mocking the same strategies, but we don't always have to say yes to that.
Thank you so much, Professor Beatriz. If we could move on to Professor Mirosław, if you want to answer the question, please.
Yes, thank you for this very interesting questions. Well, speaking, I'll put my Central and Eastern European hat on right now, as I think is much more interesting than the British perspective, which I would represent currently based on my my institution affiliation. I must say that that the government change in Brazil, actually in Central and Eastern Europe, was not received that well. Why? Because the new government would not clearly condemn Russian aggression of Ukraine. That is currently the biggest news in our region, of course, and all the countries of the region sort of now went into a war mode, even though we're not, of course, all at war, just Ukraine is. Just being so close to Russia is making us worried. So when the new Brazilian administration would not condemn Russia as the sole responsible for the current war, and especially here, I mean one one press conference of the current Brazilian president, where he said something along the lines that both sides are to blame. That was extremely badly received in Central Poland, Hungary, Czechia, and all the Baltic countries. So, of course, personally knowing Brazilian reality, I of course understand this positioning as a neutral country, in not only today but also beforehand in history. However, unfortunately, the bigger social perception right now in regard to this new government is that it's well, Russian friendly. Why? Because if you're not anti-Russia, clearly, then it must mean you're pro-Russian, and of course that means missing the very sensibilities of South America in general, not only Brazil, but that's the reality. Yeah, so I think I'll stop here. Thank you for that's a very interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your answer. Professor Vineet, if you'd like to take it from here.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, the region that I can talk about with some authority is South Asia, which is a bit too far from Latin America. But I think more generally, because Latin America is imperialism's backyard, right? So in a way, to me, Latin America measures sort of the temperature of the world. It's a premonition to what's coming to the world. In a way, therefore, I think when you elect leftist governments, the rest of the world follows. When you elect rightist governments, the rest of the world follows. So in a way, we take a lot of inspiration from what's going on in Latin America. So that way, it's I think there is some connection there in terms of why things happen first in Latin America. Second, I think most specifically, I think, the formulation that I can talk about is probably BRICS, where Brazil and South Africa are literally the only two democracies left. I don't call India a democracy anymore. So if there is any sort of hope from the grand vision of the third world, it's with actually Brazil and South Africa right now. But it also changes from governments to governments. I don't really have much hope from BRICS anyways. But I think in BRICS, there is this opportunity for Brazil and South Africa in particular to show leadership role. I don't know if they're capable enough or they're allowed. That's a different question. The question about I'm not sure which part you missed, or if you want me to sort of talk about my whole presentation. But if I had to sort of summarize the whole thing, I just want to say I'm angry, and a lot of it is I think the anger about how we're not talking about Gaza enough. We can have tons and tons of decolonial conferences about anything, decolonization, but I think this is a moment to talk about just one issue, which is Gaza. And a lot of it, and this is sort of a response to a lot of post-colonial sort of scholars, who've made their careers out of talking about sort of colonialism, but are shying from talking about what's happening in Gaza. So, and it's a reflection on why we're shying to talk about what's happening in Gaza. And in some ways, I think that at some point, we've become brilliant at navel-gazing in terms of critiquing discourses. And I'm talking more about the theoretical stuff. I'm not really talking about some of the great points that I think my colleagues have made here. But we've become so much about discursive sort of deconstruction that we've forgotten that there's a world outside that exists. Yes, we can criticize the global north for lots of things, but the global south at this moment is a place where there are tons of illiberal countries where their rights of people are being sort of taken away. In India, for instance, Muslims are being, it's so hard to be a Muslim in India right now. And a lot of most of decolonial or post-colonial stuff in India doesn't talk about it. It just keeps talking about the global north. Yes, I want to hear about the problem with the global north all the time, but I think it is the responsibility of scholars from the global south, and I'm mostly talking about my own country, to talk about the plight of the Dalits, to talk about the plight of the Muslims, to stand against the regime which is neo-fascist, especially at a time when your ideology or the language that post-colonialism has provided is legitimizing, is justifying a neo-fascist regime. So I think that's the whole point I want to sort of say, that post-colonial scholars, it is our responsibility to move out from our sort of ivory towers in some ways and think about our responsibility to the society we are in. I think that was the broad point I was making.
That's great. Thank you so much. And on that note, we also, I think you've touched on this a little bit, but we have a question on the YouTube chat. Renata sent in a question for you, Professor Vineet. She has, since you were thinking about the Palestinian case, how do you perceive the disconnect between academic decolonial thought and practical decolonial processes? And she also says she'd like to hear more from you, since you mentioned, Frantz Fanon, about the challenges that academic environments face in discussing the matter of violence in decolonization.
Thank you for those brilliant questions. I mean, I haven't really thought them through, but I think that is exactly what I was sort of talking about, this divorce that we're increasingly seeing between a discourse and the process. And the fact is, the process is often messy, right? And this is what we've seen even in the case of, Gaza, where, I mean, there was an attack by Hamas, which is condemnable. We can mourn for the lives of people who were murdered in that sort of horrific attack. But that also tells you the whole process of decolonization is messy. And as sort of scholars, we ought to be ready to discuss that messiness and to be able to forthright an opinion. And this is not a moment to hide behind this whole idea that the conflict is complex and therefore we shouldn't be talking about it. It is our responsibility as decolonial scholars, because we have thought about this. It is like you said, Fanon. We can read Fanon on you want, but Fanon was also sort of, he was not only a theorist, he was also, in a revolutionary way, that he was a member of the FLN. He was actually the roving ambassador for FLN. He was ambassador for FLN in Ghana. So he participated in those struggles. I'm not saying that every decolonial scholar needs to go and sort of fight in Gaza, but the point I'm trying to say is that, this is not a moment for us to sort of go into our shells and reflect on things. This is a moment for us to show solidarity in every possible way. I don't know what that solidarity would look like. It could be from individual action to whatever public action. I don't know. But what I sort of, in a way, feel very angsty about is sort of this tendency to argue that, no, this is a moment for reflection. I don't think this is a moment for reflection. It's a complex conflict because the political solutions are complex. The morality of what's happening is not complex at all. So I think those are kind of things we have to think about in terms of thinking about Gaza.
Thank you so much, Professor Thakur, for your response. We have another question from Professor Igor Castellano. I'll let him ask you.
Obrigado, Professora Joséli. Thank you very much for your brilliant insights and to share your ideas with us. For us, it's a pleasure to welcome you and to hear from you. I'd like to ask 3 questions, one for each speaker. The first one for Professor Mirosław. I think your research is very insightful and very important for us to find how politics and history and international relations is very close to us in the public space. So my question is regarding these changes and this process of changing public spaces and monuments to effectively represent, for example, untold or decolonial stories. Which or what actors did you find that were active and agent in those processes? Because sometimes we can find this process of changing narratives a very elite-centered process, and social groups sometimes do not really participate in these changes, so they are actually almost like passive in these situations. I would really like to hear from you and in your research projects what kind of agency social groups had in those processes. Professor Vineet, thank you very much again. It's a pleasure to see you. And in terms of these idea of decolonial and post-colonial thought or thinking, to reorganize a kind of politics of liberation and think about bringing again the idea of liberation and these praxis side of thinking. I would like to know what are your thoughts on the sources of inspiration that decolonial and post-colonial scholars may find or may track. Can we find inspiration, for example, in that first generation of post-colonialism, that militant scholars or militant politicians became scholars and vice versa? So could that be a source of inspiration, or can you offer us any other refreshing idea of inspiration that we could find in society nowadays? And Professor Beatriz, thank you very much for your thoughts and your inspiration you brought to us as well this afternoon here in Brazil. I was thinking about these very impressive image of third world countries being such authoritative and in a position of coloniality against neighbors and migrants. So and this is very impressive in the colonial, within the post-colonial and colonial thinking. And I was wondering if we are already equipped to understand theoretically, how can we understand coloniality within the third world or the global south? Are we really equipped, are relating to global south populations in a very colonializing way or authoritative way, and even social groups, for example, the right-wing rise in Latin America and in many other regions. We can identify, I believe, that social groups are really eager to demonstrate those idea of those conservative and reactionary ideas against global south brothers and sisters. So do you think we are nowadays equipped with good theories to understand those processes that we are seeing? Thank you very much.
Professor Sadowski, can you please answer Professor Igor's question?
Yes, of course. Thank you. This is a really great question, and there's not really one good answer to it. Like the whole process, like in general of these changes that happen following a transition in general from one regime to another. I like to call like a collective memory inversion, because we have the old narrative that's coming out with its own heroes, and we have the new narrative brought on the arms of former victims, of former partisans, of former political prisoners, depending on the current situation, that come in and try to change everything. However, the question always remains how to choose the new heroes. And actually, this is not an easy question. And not only democratic transitions here give us good answers about the process. I earlier this year with an Iranian colleague, we did a study of changes to collective memory in Iran following the Iranian Revolution. So of course we didn't have a democratic transition there. However, we had a very big political transition there, and what our research uncovered was that actually the mechanisms are quite similar. So usually at the first stage, we have this rush to change, the most blatant examples of the former narrative. So be that the monuments or street names that are most linked to the former regime, these go first. Then we have usually a more of an institutionalization of the process rather than, a mob of protesters putting down a monument, pulling down a monument, or just a spontaneous street name change. We have it institutionalized, legalized, and we have a proper legal process as to how to do it. And then quite often we have a third stage, which is usually some years later. I would say from my also my other research, about 10, even sometimes 20 years time, when people start to notice also the small remnants of the past regime still present, and they pressure the local authorities to the change, or the national authorities, so that they can initiate the change. However, the question still remains what new heroes to choose, and actually that's something that Ukraine has had an issue with, because quite often the new heroes which replaced the old Soviet ones were those linked to the Ukrainian nationalist organizations from the 1940s, which were involved in massacres of Jewish and Polish populations. Well, go back to the case of Iran, for example. Following the Iran-Iraq war, there has been a slew of changes of street names to those who so-called martyrs of the war, so soldiers who died in this war. So today, for example, it's estimated that a large part of street names in Tehran are named after those soldiers. So we had these first waves at first following the revolution there, and then a second wave that was institutionalized, and then we had this third wave sometimes later at the end of 1980s following the war, when there was the present need to commemorate someone. So in general, I would say these institutionalized collective memories are never safe. And unfortunately, they are bound to political pressures of the moment. And well, the further from the transition, it's usually the more difficult to change them. But if there are some remnants of the past out there still, they're gonna get changed sooner or later. And thank you. That was once again an excellent question.
Thank you so much, Professor Sadowski. I think we can go to Professor Thakur for the second question, please.
Yeah, thank you so very much, Igor, for that wonderful question. I was remembering, and I read this quote, I think from Umberto Eco somewhere, where he said, when people are marching to the streets, I take the opposite road and go to the library. Which is to say that the job of the scholar is to theorize about what's happening rather than participating in it, which I fundamentally disagree with. I kind of think that we tend to have a tendency of over theorizing, but sometimes what you need is actually go and join sort of the mass movements, right? In a way. We can all take inspirations from the Fanons and Césaires and sort of a pantheon of anti-colonial scholars. Those are all great works, but I think there is also slightly a danger sometimes of using the strategies of one context into another. Sort of a lot of people read Wretched of the Earth and all of that, and only read the first chapter on violence. That book, actually, if you read about it, it's exactly what happens when a colony turns into post-colony. But more importantly, that book is written in the context of sort of this brutal war, a sort of war against the Algerian people, where nearly about 800,000 people are killed in that sort of colonial war. So it's written in that context, and in a way, so every struggle needs to find its own, text. And it's not really difficult. I mean, so like I was talking about India, I mean, all that academics need to be is be good allies. There are actually people fighting on the streets. There are people, you know, there are Dalit movements, there are student movements, there are you know, there were protest movements by farmers, and there are tons of these movements. We just need to be, you know, to be good allies, to sort of try and, yes, every movement also has, I mean, and every movement is not, you know, completely benign. There are also issues which are problematic about each movement. But I think academics have to make that sort of judgment about critique itself sometimes, right? I can be very critical of nationalism in India, but I would be a hypocrite if I'm also critical in the same vein of nationalism, say, of indigenous people in Hawaii. So I think we have to sort of make these judgments, sometimes these strategic decisions, in with keeping the whole idea of liberation in mind. And for that, to the question of independent sort of inspiration, I think there is a lot of inspiration around. Like for me, I think what has happened in the past year is I've actually read a lot of Dalit literature, which I had never read before, and it's been so inspiring for me. And so I mean, I've read my Fanon, but I don't need to read Fanon because there's already so much literature in my context. And I think that's where you get sort of inspiration from. Sorry, I've gone a whole roundabout way of answering that question. But I think all that I want to say is you need to just be good allies.
Thank you so much, Professor Thakur. And now for the last question, please, Professor Padilla.
Thank you. Thank you. This is an excellent question. And I would like to start from replicating something that just my previous colleague mentioned. I think sometimes this over-theorizing, and over-theorizing can be very dangerous, sometimes more than, you know, when there's less theorizing. And so when you talk about this image of third world countries and like going against each other, this coloniality against the neighbors, I think there is enough theory, or there's enough knowledge production that has been already done that tell us what to do or how to interpret what is going on. But I think that we need to differentiate between what we do sometimes in academia or the discussion that we're having versus what the politicians are doing. I don't think the politicians are reading anything, or they don't care about the colonial or coloniality, because they're just much more interested in looking smart, looking good for the others, that, you know, for the global north. So I do think that's really sad that we fight against each other when we're neighbors. But we've also seen how you need to divide to rule. So sometimes that is also what happens. If we just think about Latin America, could we be good neighbors to each other? I think we could if we really want. What happens is that when something is going maybe right or in the right directions, there are also other interventions from outside that try to pull someone apart from, you know, Latin American. So if there's a negotiation of what's the next country in Latin America to be able to travel to the US without a visa, then everyone wants to be, you know, whether it's Uruguay, whether it's Chile, then, you know, we're always like focusing more on like dividing us, or certain countries focus more on that, to look, you know, to be the country that looks good for the European Union, or that looks good for the United States, instead of focusing on our own relationships. So I think that we are equipped, if we want, to work together. The decision is whether we want that, or we're just happier to look better for whoever the power is that we're trying to impress. And again, the idea of divide and rule worked for Latin America, as it also worked for minorities within the United States, for example, or for many other things. So, and sometimes the elites or the governments, take a different route or a different path. Although, I mean, we do have elections, but elections take time. And sometimes, some, people, we just had elections in Argentina, which I'm not happy with the results. But we'll see what happens. And we've seen this over and over. In Brazil, you had the years with Bolsonaro, which I don't need to comment, right? And so hopefully we are looking for brighter times with Lula again. So not so sure I answered your question, but I think that there's enough theory. Sometimes we just need to do more things in action, hands-on, more practice than just theory.
Thank you so much, Professor Padilla. I think we don't have time for any other questions, so I would like to thank you very much for being here today. Every part of your lectures were very important to us for our discussions here in the graduate program in international relations and for our first event on knowledges of the Global South. So thank you so much for being here today, and we hope we can count on you to collaborate even more to bring more of knowledges from the South to our field of international relations. Thank you so much.
Muito obrigado.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.